All right, what's happening, everyone? Happy day, whatever day you happen to be watching this. I hope your day is lovely and strange noises aren't happening off screen. We're looking at turning point number 4, the fourth turning point we've looked at this year. So far, we've looked at the election of 1896, World War I, the New Deal and the Great Depression, and then here we go with the Berlin Airlift. So my students last week, we were talking about World War II. And not to say World War II is not wildly important, but in many ways, when it comes to the rest of American policy, especially foreign policy in the 20th century, the Cold War is really what dominates it. And the Berlin Airlift is really one of the first beginning points of that Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's what we're looking at today. Let's kick it. All right, so before this turning point, we have a Russian Revolution, 1918, that brings into place the first communist government in the world. Here we have good old Lenin, who was one of the great leaders of the Soviets in the beginning of that revolution. And it ushers into this, our world, really a new way of looking at government and looking at how society is organized. And just as a kind of reminder of what those basic tenets of communism are, these are the main ones. But when we look at communism, the government itself is almost entirely all-powerful. So that's where you see these totalitarian dictators that very much come into power in these communist nations. And a level of a lack of freedom for the people. Certainly there's other elements that you can look at here, but it especially is looking at this economic way of organizing things, of looking at the inequality that a capitalistic society has created and wondering if there's a different way to do it. And there's certainly many different ways, and communism is one way that was implemented. So this political difference between democratic ideals and the economic difference that communism presents when it comes to the market and wages and labor. It really is this, in the eyes of many Western politicians and workers and business owners, communism is the total opposite of how things are structured. And that is very scary for Americans and very scary for many Europeans. However, during World War II, the Soviets and the Americans are allied, namely because of the threat that the Germans played was so large that they were able to put aside their differences and philosophically of how they're looking at the world being constructed and work together to defeat the Nazis. If you look at this map here, this is near the end of the war, where the Soviets are coming in from the east and the Americans, the French, and the British are coming in from the west. And they very much converge on Germany, which, when the war is over and Germans have surrendered, the question is, well, what do we do with Germany? And the details of the Paris Peace Agreement divide up, I should do this before, they divide up Germany into quadrants. So we have parts of the Germany that are being controlled by the British, the Americans, the French, and the Russians, Soviets. If you notice in the middle of this map, there's this strange little multicolored area, which is Berlin. So Berlin, being the capital of Germany, and of the most important cities in the nation, instead of it being given solely to the Soviets, who took the eastern part of the country, Berlin itself is divided between all those powers. So if you look at the colors that are on this map here, and those match the colors here. So this divided Berlin ends up being our focus here, and really what sparks off the conflict of the Cold War that lasts for the next few decades. And before I touch on that, though, I would like to note that the other thing that is going on at the end of World War II is the colonies and territories that are being controlled by a lot of these European powers. Namely, if you look at this map, the French have huge areas of control in Africa. The British, as we know, their empire spread across the planet. The end of World War II really brought an end to these empires. And why that factors into this, and I want you to keep it in mind when we're thinking about the Cold War moving ahead, is it really does present an opportunity for the Soviets and the Americans to influence how nations are going to choose their destinies. Are they going to become communists? Or are they going to have democratic leaders? And this fact after the war is really what does drive the rest of the Cold War. Because the Cold War, if anything, is really a war of influence. It's a war of the Americans and the Soviets trying to get other countries to behave in the way that they do. And that really begins here as a conflict in Berlin, specifically because it's so divided already. And when Berlin's divided, if you look at this map here, the Soviets have the East and the French, British, and Americans have the West. Now, in 1948, the Soviets block all of the railways, the roads, and the canals that lead into the western part of Berlin. However, they are not able to block the airport. And why they're blocking this is they're trying to force the Allies here, the Americans, the French, and the British, to accept the currency that they are putting into place. Because the Soviets, remember, want this economic power. It's very much part of communism. So instead of caving into the demands, essentially, the Soviets are holding Western Berlin hostage. The Allies decide to, since they can't drive things in, bring them in on trains or bring them on ships, they decide to fly in the supplies. So for over a year, over 200,000 flights are put into place to take what the Soviets were hoping as larger control over the city, and in fact allow the democratic rule and democratic and capitalistic economies to flourish in the western part of the city. And it's this massive effort to provide all of the essentials that the western part of Berlin needed: food, clothing, medical supplies, whatever you have, all of these had to come in by plane. So for a year and a half, over 200,000 flights, the part of West Berlin was totally supplied by the Allies. At one point, at the highest, most rapid part of this operation, there was a plane landing at the airport in West Berlin every 30 seconds. Eventually, the Soviets in 1949 gave up. They realized that the tenacity of the Allies was far, much more than they were willing to keep going on, and the blockade ended. But that didn't really stop things, because if you remember, we have this whole eastern part of Berlin, but also we have a large part of eastern Germany. And a lot of Germans are looking at this communism thing being like, I don't really like this a whole lot. We don't have a lot of power. The Soviets are taking away a lot of our freedoms. And people try to move back to the western part of Germany. Now, the Soviets are not very happy about this because all of the people that they're depending on running a country are leaving. So after the Berlin airlift, a lot of things do occur. And one of the first things is the Berlin Wall is built specifically to prevent the East Berliners and East Germans from escaping over to the West. Additionally, this, as I said, why it's a turning point, is it does have a massive influence in how the world is organized. One of the big changes and one of the big organizations that is created is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is still in existence today. And the point of NATO, if you look at this map here, these are the NATO nations currently. NATO was a strategic defense organization. So if you are a member of NATO, if you are a member of NATO and you are invaded or somehow threatened, specifically by Russia, but it could be other folks as well, the other nations will come to your defense. And it creates this Western bloc of nations. And the Soviets, in turn, create their own bloc of nations that are their allies, that they pledge to defend themselves. But it really splits the world into two. It splits the world into an east-west divide of nations that are supporting democracy and capitalism, and nations that are supporting a communist ideology. So the result of the Berlin blockade is it really encourages many other nations to recognize the threat that the Soviets are potentially having in the world, and encouraging nations that this mutual defense, that this alliance is going to be in their best interest. And that's very much as we continue for the rest of the Cold War. If you look at this map, slightly blurry, not sure why. You have these Western aligned nations, so they might not be in NATO, but they are associated with the United States, and their allies are in blue. The green ones were former colonies of those nations as well, a bit up for grabs, which ends up being the places where we see conflicts, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week, my students, and then the Soviet-aligned nations as well. So the Berlin Airlift really starts this division. It starts this, let's see the power play between the Americans and the Soviets, and that continues for decades to come. What my students who are going to be looking at in class this week is really stepping back. Instead of saying, look, what happened in the 60s, what happened in the 70s, what happened in the 80s. We're going to be looking at a map of the world, and you are going to be plotting the location on the map of various conflicts that the Americans and the Soviets use. It's called a proxy war. Instead of the Soviets and Americans, it's not a hot war, it's the Cold War. Instead of them fighting in open conflict, they kind of use these other areas around the world as their own conflicts. I'm going to support this side, and you're going to support that side. So my students in class this week, we're going to be looking at that. I've sent you the assignment in Google Classroom. People that are watching randomly on YouTube, glorious. It's lovely to see you. I hope whatever you do after this is also as entertaining. But that's really the Berlin Airlift and what caused it, what happened during it, and some of the effects that it had on the world. So that's about it. We will catch y'all on the flip side.